LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the August 5th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out the weekend's dozen best, most newsworthy clips for which it'd be a really educational, informative, fair use media criticism and political analysis show for you all tonight. The political comedy source tonight will be the return of HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. Bill Maher was back from about a month break, and I will have about a 2-minute clip from his monologue that amazingly covers all the main topics, even though a couple of the topics have to do with new Trump tweets from this morning, important Trump tweets regarding collusion and, of course, the media being the enemy of the people. Those will both, I'll show you screenshots of those in just a minute. But the big news of the morning from one of those tweets is that Trump basically admitted collusion, at least in terms of his son, Don Jr., and his campaign manager and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. They all participated in a collusion meeting, according to a tweet from Trump this morning that I'll show you in a minute. But as I promised, before I get to the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, and I get to my clip list. If you want to follow this clip list, I put a link down to that in the video description of my dozen clips and a couple still images. Those will be the tweets that I'll show you. Before I get to all the actual news, like I promised, I'm going to start with 2 minutes from the return of Bill Maher, where he actually covers the whole thing that collusion's not a crime thing that started earlier in the week, and of course is sort of like climaxed with the Trump tweet this morning, and also covered the obstruction of justice tweet where he told Jeff Sessions to stop investigating him, and that made some of the news summaries I'll show you in a minute. And basically I think that, like I said, all the important issues were covered in Bill Maher's monologue, 2-minute clip, even though not as in great a detail as you'll see in the news summaries, which I'll get to after we watch this first clip together over here.
Our president has always been unhinged, and I have to say, in the last month, he did not get more hinged. Did you see? This week, he held 2 of his hillbilly Nuremberg rallies, and it's scary to people in this profession. I mean, he calls the media the enemy of the people, except, of course, for Fox News. They're so far up his ass, they're the enema of the people. Yeah, from now on, collusion, not a crime, but journalism apparently is. We live in a country now where reporting reality gets attacked because it threatens the fantasy world created by the cult leader. So it was kind of good to see a couple of days ago all our top security people, head of the FBI, head of the director of national intelligence, all those dudes were out there saying, it was Russia. It's Russia now. It's happening again. It's not a drill. Now, if we can just get the commander-in-chief on the same page. Because when Trump says no collusion, he means with his own national security team. How can these people expect to do their job when the president himself is tweeting, as he did a couple of days ago, that the attorney general has to stop this rigged witch hunt with Russia? What happened to I can't comment on an ongoing investigation? Remember those days? And if you're so innocent, why do we have to stop the investigation? It's a little suspicious. It's like when you come home and the first thing the kids say is, the babysitter's a liar. How would I know that? Don't think that deeply.
So, yeah, at that point, Bill Maher tells us not to look too deeply into his jokes, so I won't really sometimes I criticize some of Bill Maher's jokes and some of his shows for some of the stances he's taken over the last few years, but I thought several of those jokes were funny, and none of them were distasteful, so I picked out that 2 minutes for the political comedy to start the show. But like I said, he did cover those three topics: the press being the enemy of the people, the collusion not being a crime, and even that whole obstruction of justice tweet where he said that Jeff Sessions should shut down the Mueller witch hunt. And that is not, I don't have a screenshot of that tweet, but I do have these two others that came this morning. The first one, you can see, came earlier. This is 4:38 a.m. I believe Twitter gives me Pacific time here in California, so that's like 7:38 on the East Coast, which is important because this tweet definitely made it into all the shows. Well, and I'll show you them dealing with it. And of course, it says almost all of the news anchors who asked about this, or the ones that in the clips I'm going to show you, asked about how it is that the press or the fake news starts wars, and they were all incredulous about that, which that wasn't the part that I found most disturbing, because, there have been ways that the press have been involved in starting wars. If you follow Glenn Greenwald's Twitter feed or on Facebook, he made a really good case about how the press was complicit in the beginning of the Iraq War with the whole weapons of mass destruction thing, that there were a few outlets that looked into it, but most of them were like cheerleaders for the Bush administration, also Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, all of that. And then just myself, I was thinking, if you want to remember something, what about Remember the Maine? That was like the Hearst newspapers getting the United States into the Spanish-American War, like hyping the explosion of this ship in Cuba that I think it turned out wasn't even the people who we ended up going to war with. So there are just some examples of, and I will, like I said, I'll show you several instances where members of the press really focused on this one and asked, how do we start wars and all that with the newsmaker clips, and they didn't focus as much on this one that came a little less than an hour later. And this was really the big news. It may be because, like I said, it's 5:35 a.m. That's 8:35. Maybe it did come up in several of the shows, but maybe it came up during the taping of the shows, or I'm not exactly sure. So maybe I'll give them the benefit of the doubt on that. But this is so much more important than another attack on the press. But of course, the press really focused on the attack on the press tweet, but this is basically an admission of collusion. All this time, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. And later I'll show you on ABC's This Week, George Stephanopoulos did a pretty good job of showing how the story has changed so much on that Trump Tower meeting that's in this tweet here. That's the June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., and several Russians, including, if I can get her name right, Natalia Veselnitskaya. And of course, this tweet here doesn't mention Russians, but it basically admits finally that it was a meeting to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. And here it is, like, everybody, it's done all the time in politics. It's totally legal, which of course isn't even true. As I was pointing out just last week, if you look down in my video description, you'll see one of the statutes, like the second statute I quote there, is 52 U.S. Code Section 30,121, Contributions and Donations by Foreign Nationals, where it is a crime to receive or even solicit something of value from a foreign national. It doesn't have to be the government, it doesn't apply to like permanent residents with green cards. They can contribute to elections, but foreign nationals who are like in foreign countries, they can't give you something of value, including opposition research. So it is not totally legal. And anyway, like I said, that came right at the very end, and it was covered not so well, especially that second tweet by the media. But I'm going to try to cover those two different tweets that came this morning after I show you 4 different news summaries, starting with NBC Meet the Press, which I will discuss with you I like the whole serious versus literal thing he starts with, and I'll discuss the rest of my thoughts about this since I've been talking for quite a while after we watch this 4-minute, 17-second news summary from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning here.
One of the questions that emerged during the 2016 presidential campaign was this: should we take Donald Trump seriously or literally? Well, now he's president of the United States. So are we supposed to take him seriously or literally when he says of the Mueller investigation that his attorney general should stop what he calls this rigged witch hunt right now? Are we supposed to take him seriously or literally when hours after his intelligence and security chiefs say that the U.S. election integrity for 2018 is still under attack from Russia, the president tells a rally that the Russia investigation is a hoax? Are we supposed to take him seriously or literally when he calls legitimate journalism fake news and says the press is the enemy of the people and even can cause war? And what are we supposed to make of the ralliers devoted to the president who heckle reporters, wear T-shirts, say F the media, and flash middle fingers at TV news cameras? Are we supposed to dismiss them? Or should we take their anger seriously? President Trump's supporters say, don't take the rally seriously or literally. They're just WrestleMania-like entertainment. Cue Mean Gene Okerlund. The White House says, don't take the president's tweets seriously or literally. They're not policy. They're just the president's opinion. In other words, the president's supporters have resorted to excusing his behavior as opposed to attempting to defend it. It's hard to know whether we're supposed to take that seriously or literally.
The Russian witch hunt. A Democrat-inspired witch hunt.
At a campaign rally in Ohio last night, the president unleashed his latest series of attacks.
Maxine Waters is leading the charge. A seriously low IQ person. The fake news media. Democrats are obstructionists. The only thing they do well, they're lousy politicians. They have horrible, stupid policies. They are haters.
The lashing out, a sign of a president who appears increasingly rattled. On Wednesday, Mr. Trump made his most direct call yet for an end to the Mueller investigation, tweeting, Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now. His lawyer quickly claimed the tweet was not evidence of obstruction of justice, but then argued the president could obstruct justice if he wanted to.
If he wanted to obstruct it, he'd obstruct it. I mean, he could just end it. And then you'd all battle whether he has the legal right to do that, which I think he does. But he's not going to do that.
Mr. Trump's attacks are escalating as his associates face mounting legal jeopardy. The bank and tax fraud trial of his former campaign chairman began this week with prosecutors presenting evidence that when money from a Russia-friendly Ukrainian political party dried up, Paul Manafort became desperate for cash, raising the question of why he agreed to an unpaid job with Mr. Trump's campaign in 2016. At the time, Manafort talked about the access that campaign offered.
They're coming to me to find ways to get involved in the Trump campaign.
You're seeing more people want to get involved?
People that I know want to get involved, yes.
Do you think you
and wanted to before, but didn't have a way in.
One Republican tells Vanity Fair the Manafort trial is spinning him into a frenzy. Then there's the threat from his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, who signaled he might strike a deal with prosecutors and spill the president's secrets. And the special counsel is interviewing more associates of another longtime Trump campaign aide, Roger Stone. For months, Mr. Trump has had one relentless talking point.
There was no collusion at all. No collusion whatsoever. No collusion. No collusion. Absolutely no collusion.
With mounting evidence of contacts between Mr. Trump's campaign and Russia, this week, the president's attorneys tried a new argument.
Collusion is not a crime. I don't even know if that's a crime, colluding about Russians.
Collusion is not a crime.
Mr. Trump echoed, quote, collusion is not a crime. But that doesn't matter because there was no collusion. In a PR cleanup attempt, the administration's top intelligence officials held a briefing Thursday at the White House, vowing to combat Russian interference in the midterms, now just over 90 days away.
This threat is not going away.
And we're doing everything we can to have a legitimate election that the American people can have trust in.
But just hours later,
we're being hindered by the Russian hoax. It's a hoax, okay?
Joining me now is Republican Senator Roy Blunt.
So that was the longest of the news summaries. I like the framing from Chuck Todd at the beginning, the seriously versus literally thing, and that whether we should take the tweet seriously. I think it didn't focus enough on that second tweet, but like I said, maybe that came because they did. Chuck Todd did show it during the panel discussion, but maybe he didn't get it in time for the introduction. I can't be sure about that. But even though that had the most facts, and it even showed you sort of the transition from no collusion to collusion isn't even a crime. And by the way, if you not only do I have a link down in the video description to the crime of accepting something of value from a foreigner into your campaign, that's a crime, but also conspiracy to defraud the United States. That'll come up in some of the George Stephanopoulos questions to Jay Sekulow, one of Trump's lawyers. I have 2 of those, and they're pretty amazing. They're sort of like a new version of alternative facts that you'll hear from Jay Sekulow in one of those clips. But before I get to that, I want to show a few more news summaries. The next one is from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, which is about half as long as the last news summary. So it has less facts, less context, but I think it's better focused, especially on the breaking news and the Don Jr. angle. Maybe it has to do with the timing, but I will talk about that clip with you after we watch together here.
Welcome to This Week. The great American poet Carl Sandburg once said, "If the law is against you, argue the facts. If the facts are against you, argue the law. And if both are against you, pound the table and yell like hell." Now, we don't yet know all the facts that Robert Mueller has gathered about President Trump and his team, which laws, if any, they may have broken. But watching President Trump this week, he sure seemed like a man who is worried about both. A week filled with his most direct and personal attacks yet on the special counsel. It started Sunday with baseless claims about Mueller's conflicts. On Monday, Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani supplemented Trump's routine denials of Russian collusion with a new argument. Collusion is not a crime. For good measure, a presidential tweet took on both the law and the facts. Collusion is not a crime, but that doesn't matter because there was no collusion. Then came his call to shut down the investigation. Clear words from the President of the United States. Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now before it continues to stain our country any further. Words the White House tried to clean up.
It's not an order, it's the president's opinion. The president is not obstructing, he's fighting back. He's been, I think, crystal clear about how he feels about this investigation from the beginning. I think I've clarified this about 10 times now. It's the president's opinion. I don't have anything further.
One big question, what new this week triggered these extraordinary outbursts? Was it the opening of Paul Manafort's trial? The looming showdown with Mueller over a presidential interview? Or this new reporting from the Washington Post? Trump has also expressed to confidants lingering unease about how some in his orbit, including his eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., are ensnared in the Russia probe. As one advisor described the president's thinking, he does not believe his son purposely broke the law, but is fearful nonetheless that Trump Jr. inadvertently may have wandered into legal jeopardy. A lot of questions ahead now for the president's attorney, Jay Sekulow. Jay, thank you for joining us again.
And like I said, I have 2 good Jay Sekulow clips coming up, including one in which George Stephanopoulos specifically brings up this, like, Don Jr. colluded with the Russians tweet from Trump this morning, which wasn't in the news summary, but it did include that reporting from the Washington Post that Trump is worried that Don Jr. may be in legal jeopardy, and that wasn't included in the NBC Meet the Press news summary, but it is included in this next news summary, CNN State of the Union, because the actual reporting on that came from the Washington Post, got that from some sources, and then CNN, you'll see Jake Tapper mentions, they also got that reporting independently from the Washington Post. Although Jake Tapper here actually starts off with the State of the Union. You know, every week he says, what's the State of the Union? This week it is hitting the campaign trail. And he talks about the rallies, what I think what Bill Maher referred to in the first clip I showed is hillbilly Nurembergs, you know, because of the Hitler Nuremberg rallies. I guess that was kind of funny. I found that somewhat amusing in kind of a dark humor way, but then CNN State of the Union actually covers most of the same facts you saw in the last news summaries, which I'm going to contrast with the final news summary from Fox News Sunday, where, of course, they actually don't really cover any of this stuff and mostly cover what Trump's doing on the campaign trail, which, like I said, is what Jake Tapper starts off with, but he actually covers the rest of this breaking stuff over in this 90-second clip here.
I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is hitting the campaign trail after visiting the site of a special House election in Ohio last night. President Trump is back at his resort in Bedminster, New Jersey, and already hate tweeting against journalists. Sources close to the White House told me and White House reporter Caitlin Collins that the president is increasingly worried about his son Don Jr.'s possible legal exposure in the Mueller probe. The Washington Post reported something similar, and the president just tweeted a response to the reporting, saying, quote, fake news reporting, a complete fabrication, that I am concerned about the meeting my wonderful son Donald had in Trump Tower. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent. Totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. I did not know about it. President Trump, of course, acknowledging there that that meeting at Trump Tower was to get information about Hillary Clinton from a Russian government attorney. That's a complete contradiction to the original explanation that the meeting was primarily about adoption. Another worry for President Trump, holding on to the Republican majority in the House in November. Saturday, the president left his golf course and headed to a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where he's trying a Republican congressional seat that should have been safe, trying to keep it Republican. Midterms are right around the corner, but potential Democratic presidential candidates are already building a case for 2020, looking beyond the midterms, speaking out against the politics of division at the Progressive Netroots Conference in New Orleans. One Democratic leader who's lending his voice to try to help the party in 2018.
Yeah, that was Deval Patrick, and I'm not going to show any of his interview, although he may be a possible presidential candidate. And my one criticism of Jake Tapper is you saw in there, he had like this tweet where Trump admits collusion, and he didn't really ask any of his guests about it. It's like all of his questions were prepared before that tweet came in, and so even though I thought it was one of the biggest pieces of news, not that there isn't so much news, it's like constant barrage of news these days, I guess, but I thought that Jake Tapper should have been better about using those. That's why I don't have any other clips from CNN State of the Union, because he didn't really cover the breaking tweets in his interviews. Not that they weren't good interviews, but if you want to see all of CNN State of the Union, there's a link to that down in the video description. And like I said, Jake Tapper did start off his State of the Union with hitting the campaign trail, but then he covered all this other stuff about the, collusion and obstruction of justice, and the Washington Post, CNN report that Donald Trump is worried that his Don Jr. is in legal jeopardy. None of that came up in the Fox News Sunday news summary I'm about to show you. It really was about hitting the campaign trail, and the only real negative story is sort of the split between Trump continuing to call the Russia story a hoax, but his national security team going out there and trying to tell the American people that they're taking Russia meddling in the election, the last election, and they're trying to meddle in the upcoming election. They're taking it really seriously. And you'll see that Chris Wallace does talk about that, and Kristen Fisher talks about that as well, and then talks about the rallies. And there's this one point where I almost think she says first that Donald Trump is stealing the heat, and then she says also feeling the heat. I don't know. Tell me if you think she says stealing the heat, which is, it's a pretty pro-Trump analysis that doesn't really cover any of the other stuff you saw in the news summaries. The hardest thing they hit him on is tariffs, which I will talk about with you after we watch that Fox News Sunday news summary with Chris Wallace and Kristen Fisher over here.
News in Washington. While top national security officials say the threat from Russian meddling in the upcoming midterms is real, President Trump keeps calling it a hoax. It's just one of several issues, along with North Korea and Iran, where the president's statements appear at odds with the rest of his administration. In a moment, I'll talk about the seeming disconnect with the president's national security advisor, John Bolton. But first, let's bring in Kristen Fisher in Columbus, Ohio, where President Trump held another of his highly charged rallies last night. Kristen.
Well, Chris, this was President Trump's second campaign rally since 5 of his top national security officials stood side by side, sounding the alarm that Russia is continuing to try to interfere in our elections. And yet, at both rallies, President Trump did not back them up.
We got to stop meddling. We got to stop everybody from attacking us. But there are a lot. Russia's there. China's there.
President Trump once again refusing to place the blame squarely on Russia, but he had no problem taking China to task for smacking U.S. farmers with retaliatory tariffs.
China is targeting the American farmer because China is smart and they know the American farmers love Donald Trump and they say, what can we do to stop Donald Trump?
The retaliatory tariffs are hitting one of the president's key constituencies, prompting a $12 billion bailout for farmers. The president's lengthy defense of his tariffs inside a sweltering high school gymnasium made clear he's feeling the heat.
So much for my brand new beautiful suit.
The president and Republicans are also feeling the heat heading into Tuesday's special election for Ohio's 12th congressional district. It's why President Trump came to this reliably Republican district to rally his supporters around Troy Balderson, who's locked in a tight race with Democrat Danny O'Connor.
A vote for Danny Boy and the Democrats is a vote to let criminals and drugs pour into our country and to let MS-13 run wild in our communities.
And that is exactly what we can expect more of heading into the midterms. This was President Trump's third campaign rally this week, and that pace is only expected to accelerate. Chris?
Kristen Fisher reporting from Columbus.
Wow, President Trump has so much energy. That, like I said, I mean, a lot of times the news reports you see on Fox News, my standard for why I call it Trump TV is because it looks like almost everything in there could have been written by the Trump administration, except maybe the part about the split on national security, you know, pointing out how Trump isn't really being as serious about saying it was Russia. He's, you know, could be somebody else, could be China, could be a lot of people. And that's basically the only discrepancy between how I think that, you know, Sarah Huckabee Sanders would have written that report and the way Kristen Fisher did it there. You can disagree with me if you want to, but that, like I said, I thought that news summary, especially in juxtaposition to the other three I showed, it just shows you Fox News bias. Fox News bias lives, even though I don't make Fox News bias videos very often anymore. It's still there, even on Fox News Sunday. But the next two clips I want to show you, these are a couple of my favorite clips from the show. This is the Sekulow clips talking to George Stephanopoulos. And there's just like some amazing, like slippery lawyerliness and I mean, some of the things here, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a lawyer and I used to do criminal defense work as a public defender, not for this kind of, you know, obstruction of justice. Although I was a law clerk with the federal public defender for a year, so I know a little bit about the federal law. And of course, I always have my Constitution right here, so I can look into the Constitution if anything like that should happen to come up. Right over there, I have Sandy lying down by my American Constitutional Law book. I will show a Sandy and Dash clip at the end, including Sandy lying down next to my American Constitutional Law book by Lawrence Tribe. And whatever, none of that's going to come up. But some of the things that Sekulow says here are just ridiculous, especially this first clip is George Stephanopoulos asking him about the tweet I showed you earlier, basically admitting finally that the June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Don Jr., Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner, and Natalia Veselnitskaya and various other Russians was about getting dirt on Hillary Clinton. And as I mentioned before, down in the video description, you can see statutes saying that it's illegal to get something of value from a foreigner. That's one law that violates. There's conspiracy to defraud the United States. And so that's what's illegal here. But you're about to see Sekulow claim, oh, you know, there's nothing illegal about that, you know, because you'll George Stephanopoulos asks, you know, is that legal? And he says, well, you know, what's illegal about that? And I will discuss that with you after we watch that 2.5-minute clip together over here.
And just before you came on the air, another tweet from the president about what I just had there about Don Jr. He said, fake news is reporting a complete fabrication, that I am concerned about the meeting my wonderful son Donald had in Trump Tower. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent, totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. I did not know about it. A lot to unpack right there. I assume you agree with the president that he's not concerned, but he says the meeting totally legal, done all the time in politics. But according to the email that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has, this was a meeting to get information from the Crown Prosecutor of Russia on Hillary Clinton's campaign. How would that be legal?
Well, the question is, how would it be illegal? I mean, the real question here is, would a meeting of that nature constitute a violation, the meeting itself constitute a violation of the law? And what you have is a situation, and I've said this well over a year, you have to look at what laws, rules, regulations, statutes are purportedly violated here. And when you really look at this, George, and you look at the comments that the president made this week via Twitter, if you look at the comments that my colleague Mayor Giuliani has stated, they're in one sense rather unremarkable in that the idea that this has been going on now for well over a year, let's be honest with the American people, there are irregularities in this investigation, the likes of which we have not seen. And so when you look at, whether the president was, I think the phrase you used was frustrated, the fact of the matter is, who would not be concerned that the lead investigator on your counterintelligence investigation, and we now know was going on for well over a year before Robert Mueller was put in place, was making the statements that he made to Lisa Page showing bias. How would you not be concerned that Bruce Orr, the number 4 at the Department of Justice, wife, Nellie Orr, worked for Fusion GPS, which is the organization that put together with Christopher Steele the dossier? How would you not be concerned that that individual, Bruce Orr, was still working for the Department of Justice and his wife was actually working on the dossier? So you have to look at the totality. Yeah, so when you look at a meeting, George, that took place in a year before or now 2 years ago, the question is, what law, statute, or rule or regulation has been violated? Nobody's pointed to one.
Well, they actually pointed to several, including conspiracy to defraud the United States. That would be one of the possible charges, aiding and abetting conspiracy. But I want to get to the pretty remarkable shifting of explanations.
So George Stephanopoulos does point to conspiracy to defraud the United States. He doesn't mention this statute that says you can't get something of value from a foreigner, which is the first one that comes to mind for me. And in this next clip, as I promised earlier, this is George Stephanopoulos pointing out all the changing stories on the June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting, like originally, where even Jay Sekulow said that the statement that it was all about adoption came from Don Jr. and his lawyers, which then there was like a lie behind that lie, which was that, Sarah Huckabee Sanders admitted that, like any father, President Trump helped, discussed it with his son, but he didn't dictate the statement. And then eventually in a letter from the Trump lawyers to Robert Mueller, they admit that, Trump dictated the statement. So, and then there was so it was about adoption, and then went all the way through these things to now finally today he admits that it was about getting dirt on Hillary Clinton for maybe the first time, and which is basically admitting collusion. Speaking, by the way, about lies behind lies, I saw that I got my first few Super Chat contributions already. I appreciate that from the live viewers. I saw Lulu Girl was asking about, I made a edited, produced video this week. There's a link to that down in the video description about Trump's family separation lie hiding another lie. And it's just one of many examples where you think like you've gotten to the truth behind the lie, and it's just another lie, which is what I was just explaining with this whole June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting. And to answer Lulu Girl's question there, I actually hadn't seen the Katie Tur story. I've been looking for mainstream media stories. I did see that BuzzFeed did a story on it online, like at 5 p.m. the day that I released my video, like that morning. So, but other people have blogged this. It's, you know, I'm not the first person ever to see this. And so I'll look for that Katie Tur story. But if you haven't seen my video that I made in the middle of the week, there's a link, like I said, down to it in the video description. It's only like 5 minutes long. It took me almost as long to make as it takes to make this Sunday show, maybe even longer. And I think it only made like $2 in ad revenue, and it got less views than a Sunday show. So although I did have one $20 PayPal contribution specifically targeted for me making that video, so I appreciate that for the person who made that. But that's why I don't make more edited, produced videos, because they make less, they get less views and make less revenue. There's no super chat part to it. So if you want me to make more of those edited, produced videos, go and watch it and give it a thumbs up and spread it around the internet. But now I want to move on to the second Sekulow clip, where the second half of this clip actually gets back to that same topic about what's the law that is violated by the Trump Tower meeting. And by the end of this clip, you'll see that George Stephanopoulos agrees with Sekulow. You know, you're right that, you know, there's not evidence that, or Robert Mueller's still looking into that, and that I think is a little bogus. But I think at the beginning of this, George Stephanopoulos does a really good job of showing the shifting stories on what happened at that meeting and who wrote the lying statement that went to the New York Times. And this is a little over 4 minutes. This is, like I said, this at the beginning of the show, I said there was like a new version of alternative facts from Kellyanne Conway, and I will have a Kellyanne Conway clip a little later. But the new version of alternative facts is that he says he had bad information, and it happens in cases like this, and then the facts develop, which, as a former criminal defense attorney myself, I think is a really long, drawn-out way of trying to say, my client is a big liar, he lied to me, and I'm sorry, I told you the lies my client told to me. And I will discuss that with you a little more after we watch that 4-minute, 7-second clip from ABC's This Week This Morning over here.
A pretty remarkable shifting of explanations about this meeting. The president denying again that he knew about this meeting. When he first talked about this meeting, he denied having anything to do with statements describing the meeting in a misleading way as primarily about adoptions. Now it's shifted. Now the president's saying, wait, this was a meeting to get information from our opponents, totally illegal. So that's one concession right there. And I do have to ask you about this, because I haven't had you on the program for quite a while. And last July, a year ago, when I asked you if the president had anything to do with putting out a statement about this meeting at Trump's Tower, you said he wasn't involved in any way at all. Here's what you said.
The president didn't sign off on anything. He was coming back from the G20. The statement that was released on Saturday was released by Donald Trump Jr., and I'm sure in consultation with his lawyers. The president wasn't involved in that.
You said the president wasn't involved in any way at all. Later, Sarah Sanders changed that. She said, oh, yeah, the president weighed in but didn't dictate anything. And then in January of this year, the president's legal team, including you, sent a memo to Robert Mueller saying this: you have received all of the notes, communications, and testimony indicating that the president did dictate a short but accurate response to the New York Times article on behalf of his son. So why did you deny President Trump's involvement? When did you learn that the denial wasn't true?
Well, let me tell you two things on that one. Number one, as you know, George, I was in the case at that point, a couple of weeks, and there was a lot of information that was gathering. And as my colleague Rudy Giuliani said, I had bad information at that time. I made a mistake in my statement. I've talked about that before. That happens when you have cases like this. As far as when did we correct it, the important part is the information that we've shared with the Office of Special Counsel. I'm not going to get into the details, but we were very clear as to the situation involving that trip and the statements that were made to the New York Times. So I think it's very important to point out that in a situation like this, you have, over time, facts develop. That's what investigations do. I agreed to go on your network and others days within being retained on this, and had a lot of information to process. I got that one wrong. So what does that mean? Well, for the purpose of, again, an investigation, it doesn't mean illegality. It doesn't mean criminality. And I think one of the things that we've learned here, George, after, what now, over a year of this investigation, is that there has been no evidence put forward by anyone at this point that we've seen. And we've seen 1.4 million documents. We've provided 32 witness interviews of any type of collusion on behalf of the president and the Russians. You know what we have seen, though? One of the most irregular investigations in U.S. history.
Well,
and I think if you're, Republican, Democrat, or whatever,
you've talked about the irregularities.
You can't ignore it. I mean,
I understand that, and I gave you a chance to, and I gave you a chance to explain all the irregularities you thought you saw in the investigation. I asked you about that. You said no collusion. At first, the White House said that there were no contacts with Russians. We now know there were at least 80 contacts. If the White House or anyone connected to the Trump campaign accepted information from the Russians, that could potentially be collusion. That could be considered collusion, could be considered participating with a conspiracy. So that's also the possibility of a legal violation there as well. But I do want to ask you about
in that allegation, though, you'd have to have the so-called collusion, which, by the way, is not a legal term. That's not what results in a issue of criminality. I mean, that just wouldn't be there. And by the way, you know, the phrasing here, especially at this late date, is very important. So everyone is still talking about this collusion concept. And when Rudy Giuliani said collusion's not a crime, that was, again, rather unremarkable. What was the fact? I mean, what was the facts? Well, the facts that we know is what is the violation, or what violation has anybody put forward of an actual federal statute that's been violated by the President of the United States? And we've yet to see it. And as I said, we've seen an awful lot of evidence.
That's one of the things that Robert Mueller is investigating. I agree with you on that. On Don Jr., the President...
That's one of the things that Robert Mueller is investigating. I agree with you on that. I don't know if I agree with you on that, because he didn't say anything about Robert Mueller investigating that. What he said is it's not a crime. And as I've said multiple times before I showed the last two clips, there are crimes that trying to get dirt on Hillary Clinton from Russian nationals. There's the crime of getting something of value from a foreign national, which violates campaign finance laws. There's the conspiracy to defraud the United States, which, as I discussed last week, and I put a link down in the video description to the U.S. Attorney Manual on what constitutes conspiracy to defraud the United States, and it includes a conspiracy to stop the effective functioning of the United States government, which would include the functioning of our elections. So, like, a conspiracy to mess up our elections would fall under, getting the whole Russia conspiracy that Robert Mueller has already indicted in his two previous indictments. The last one especially, the whole Russian military. So there is a ton of evidence already, and in fact the last clip I'm going to show is Representative Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, is going to answer Margaret Brennan saying, well, we can all agree that there's no evidence of collusion yet, right? And Adam Schiff says, no, there actually is evidence of collusion. But before I get to that, and I think I've given my critique of Jay Sekulow pretty clearly already, both before and after the clip. I have several other newsmakers before Adam Schiff is actually the last clip I'm going to show. But the next clip I'm going to show is actually Chuck Todd talking to, this is one of the next few clips that, like I said, shows how the media totally focused on this first tweet about the media being the enemy of the people, rather than this second tweet where Donald Trump actually admitted to there being collusion with the Russians on June 9th, 2016, with his son Don Jr., even though he says, totally legal and done all the time. No, that part's not true, but there is a big admission in there. And that wasn't really the focus of much of the questioning, other than that one question from George Stephanopoulos to Jay Sekulow, whether it's because that second tweet came out later than the first, an hour later, and that made a big difference in the whether it made the questioning of the newsmakers. I don't know whether that's true or not, but my point is that the media is totally self-involved, and they totally focused on the enemy of the press being the enemy of the people, or fake news being the enemy of the people tweet, rather than the really important Trump admits collusion tweet. And the first example of that is from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press, talking to Missouri Senator Roy Blunt, and specifically about the tweet that the press is the enemy of the people, and asking that question, what wars have the press started? And like I already talked about, Iraq and Vietnam and the Spanish-American War from the turn, the 19th to the 20th, what was that, like 1898? Isn't Spanish-American, remember the Maine, isn't 1898? I'm not sure. And I was a history major, but pretty sure it's 1898. You can check me on that, but apparently none of the hosts of any of the cable, news analysis programs on the big five corporate outlets, none of them actually remembered the Maine, including Chuck Todd when he asked the question of Roy Blunt over here.
Get into that. Sometimes I try to ignore his attacks on the press, but this morning he seemed to go a bit overboard with this tweet, and I want to get you to respond to it. The fake news hates me, saying they are the enemy of the people only because they know it's true. Puts that in all caps. I am providing a great service by explaining this to the American people. They purposely cause great division and distrust. They can also cause war. They are very dangerous and sick. Senator Blunt, I know this is not your point of view. I'm not. But at what point is this rhetoric to the point where it should stop, in your mind?
Well, it's not my point of view. I see the media, the press every day in the Capitol, walking through to my office to the floor, lots of questions, generally really good questions. I do think there's so much news out there, it's harder to focus in if you're a part of the media than it may have been at one time. And if you watch TV every day, you could find some things that you, on various news channels, you found objectionable and probably believe not to be true. The president's rallies, people seem to respond to that. I would say that I've not been to one of these rallies, but I've watched them, and that seems to be something that a lot of Americans identify with. I think all of us who try to communicate need to realize there's some real challenge out there of who believes what we say and how we say it, whether that's you or me. And the president communicates in a different way than...
Yeah, but at some point, when you call a group of people, you otherize them the way he's trying to do with the press, calling them sick and sort of dehumanizing them. It makes violence against the press easier to rationalize for some. That's the concern that many news organizations have right now.
Yes, but you could certainly find people on the news saying things about the president that are not appropriate either in terms of the
two wrongs make a right here? I mean, the president of the United States is the leader of the free world.
I don't think so.
Right.
But there's a lot of in-depth psychology that goes on some news stations every day too.
I'm not sitting there condoning that, but I guess so the president should go ahead because he doesn't like some blogger that shows up on cable television at night.
Well, even the president and his daughter disagree on this topic, and it's not the way I would approach this, and I think not the way you and I would approach it.
I guess the question is, how do you convince the president that this is bad rhetoric, that this is dangerous rhetoric, not just bad decorum?
I think the president really believes that a lot of the news is not accurate.
Do you believe that?
You can certainly, there's a vast variety of how the same news is reported. So somebody is not that middle of the road news that people my age grew up with is no longer the news.
Well, I would respectfully disagree there, particularly on this show. But I want to ask you to respond to something else. Pete Weiner.
So what do you think? Is NBC's Meet the Press the middle? Is he like the Walter Cronkite of the 21st century? That seems to be what Chuck Todd was telling Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri there at the end. And I don't know. Roy Blunt is trying to be actually middle of the road there, I think, because Missouri is kind of a swing state, although it's going a little more red recently. I lived in Missouri. I lived in St. Louis for like 5 years between like 1993 and 1998, I think. I did my last 2 years of law school in St. Louis at Washington University. That's where I have my law degree from, and I was a public defender there, so I know a little bit about Missouri. So I think Roy Blunt is not he's trying to not say anything. He's trying to be as middle of the road as possible, and I don't know, do you think he's middle of the road? Do you think that Chuck Todd is unbiased journalism? You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. But like I said before, I showed that clip. It gets even worse in these later clips in terms of the news anchors having no ability to think of any war in which the news media may have been complicit in starting the war, not the invasion of Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction, not Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, not the Spanish-American War with the Hearst newspapers ginning up response with the Remember the Maine thing, and none of that comes up with either Margaret Brennan or Chris Wallace in the next clip. But I'll start with, this is Kellyanne Conway talking to Margaret Brennan about whether the press is, or the media is the enemy of the people. Kellyanne Conway, unlike Sarah Huckabee Sanders earlier in the week, which you saw in the news summaries, Sarah Huckabee Sanders would, talking to Jim Acosta from CNN, would not say that the media isn't the enemy of the people. Kellyanne Conway actually says that, talking to Margaret Brennan, but I don't know if this is the most incisive questioning of Kellyanne Conway that I've ever seen, which I will discuss with you after we watch this 3-minute 46-second clip from CBS's Face the Nation this morning. Again, focusing, of course, on the first Trump tweet about the media, not the second Trump tweet where he admits collusion on June 9th, 2016. But I will talk about that a little more after we watch the CBS Face the Nation clip together over here.
I want to ask you, since I know you speak to the president, can you clarify some of his statements in the past 24 hours, particularly on Twitter? He's not the only president to have an adversarial relationship with the press, but his language really seems to have escalated today, saying that the fake news media cause war and they're very dangerous and sick. What wars have journalists started?
Margaret, I think the president's entire point is this, that we do have a news media that includes some reporters. So this should not be a broad brush by any statement. I've said that before. His daughter said it last week. And I know he believes it's not all. That's why he said it really refers to those who aren't always telling the truth and who are giving emotion over information, who are talking more about their own egos than doing everyman interviews. I was at that rally with the president in Pennsylvania on Thursday. I walked around and talked to people in the crowd. They're so excited about what they see in terms of progress and prosperity. Some members of the press tend to cover the parts of the rally that were about the press. But most of the people hear the major part, which is about the people and the progress and the prosperity. But Margaret, you're a serious reporter. You've worked your way to the anchor seat at Face the Nation. You were a foreign war correspondent. The idea that you share an industry with the new New York Times opinion writer who had racist tweets a couple short years ago, cancel white people, do they burn as quickly in the sun? Just really terrible things. And then, of course, Mark Caputo of Politico this week going to the rally in Tampa, and referring to Trump supporters as, quote, garbage people. If you put them all together, you have a full set of teeth. That's the state of journalism today.
You've been the victim of some targeting, and I know you're sensitive to this. So can't you understand the difference, though, when the president escalates, that there is actually, at times, physical danger potentially, that there is a risk here, that the president may want to change that rhetoric?
The president wants people to give information, news they can use. And I got to tell you, there are a growing swath of reporters, all of whom, or most of whom, I feel like I have a decent relationship with, that are sitting in the press briefing room, who have contracts on cable TV where they say things, and they say things on Twitter they would not get away with in print. It would not pass even the most virulently anti-Trump editor's desk. And so I think those standards are much lower on Twitter for these journalists, certainly on TV. I've been talking about this for 2 straight years now since the campaign. I think the temperature needs to be dialed down overall.
And
but,
you don't believe that journalists are the enemy of the people?
I don't believe journalists are the enemy of the people. I think some journalists are an enemy of the relevant.
Thank you.
And enemy of the news you can use. And I think that most of the sins are sins of omission, not commission, meaning why wouldn't more reporters, Margaret, cover the vice president receiving the remains of our fallen in North Korea? Why less than a minute on one of the major cable stations? Why wouldn't they cover more that the president held forth with African-American pastors?
CBS. And I know.
And look, I'm much more. I got to tell you, I don't mention the journalist by name. I don't mention the journalist by name, but I'm much more interested in the work of Alex Acosta than Jim Acosta, our labor secretary, because he's presiding over an economic boom. Doom was predicted.
We
boom
have
is
to
what we
leave
have in our
that.
economy.
We have to leave it here, unfortunately, Kellyanne. But I do want to get to some of the other topics we touched on with our next guest. So thank you. We're going to bring in California's.
Not the most confrontational interview of Kellyanne Conway. I don't think Margaret Brennan did that great a job. And talk about like how Trump engages in obstruction of justice in plain sight, which will be in this next clip. Kellyanne Conway just like lied in plain sight there. She says like, well, I'm not going to mention any journalists by name, but I'm more interested in the work of Alex Acosta than Jim Acosta. Jim Acosta being a journalist she mentioned by name within like 30 seconds of saying, I'm not going to mention journalists by name. Oh, Sandy's apparently wants to be fed. She's gotten up and she's looking at me plaintively. What? Are you going to whine? Okay. Sorry about that, but I will have a Sandy clip at the end. Hopefully she won't start whining. But I have been reading your commentary along the way here, and I have a viewer in Missouri who was actually had some criticism of what I said about Missouri here. I'll show you this. I don't know if you. Hopefully you had time to read that. Basically, I do agree that there's bias in a lot of different news sources. You know, Fox News is a whole different. It's a qualitatively different, not just quantitatively different in terms of the amount of bias. I think all the rest of the corporate news media outlets that I show you, they have a bias towards sensationalism and superficiality. It's not liberal or conservative, and corporate, of course. That's why, for example, you never see like Noam Chomsky on MSNBC, even though a lot of liberals like him, but he points out the corporate news media bias all the time, and so there is a lot of media bias, but my criticism of Roy Blunt there was just that is not a sufficient justification for the media being the enemy of the people. The fact that there's bias in various news outlets, that the news media, like I said, I think most of it is like superficiality and sensationalism and clickbait kind of bias more than liberal versus conservative. And of course corporate and making a profit is of course the corporate media bias as well. That's the clickbait bias. But Fox News is more like an arm of the Republican Party and now almost an arm of the Trump administration, although there is a little friction between, Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump, but not between Sean Hannity and Donald Trump, at least. And anyway, I don't want to go way off into that tangent, but I did want to answer that one comment about Missouri from someone who lives in Missouri and the difference between media bias and media being the enemy of the people that starts wars. And actually I have said ways in which I think media has been complicit in the beginning of wars. But I want to get now to the actual Fox News perspective and the real bias that I think is different from the other media biases that I talked about in terms of superficiality and sensationalism and corporatism. Here you actually have a real attempt to ignore what's right in front of you. This is like the most... I showed you the Fox News summary earlier where they pretty much ignored the obstruction of justice and collusion tweets and almost everything that's gone on in terms of that story in this last week that you saw covered in the other news summaries. Well, first I'm going to show you how Chris Wallace brought up this same tweet that the rest of the media brought up about the media being the enemy of the people, or fake news being the enemy of the people, and talking to National Security Advisor John Bolton. And of course, Chris Wallace can't understand how it is that the news media has caused wars. He doesn't remember the Maine, just like Margaret Brennan, and I'll discuss that with you after we watch that clip together over here.
Talked about the media and the idea that they all jump off the telephone line at this electric.
Not every one of them, but a lot.
But a lot of them do at the same time. In a much more direct way, the president critiqued the media, and I want to put up his tweet. He's been on something of a Twitter tear today, and this is one of them. The fake news hates me saying that they are the enemy of the people only because they know it's true. I am providing a great service by explaining this to the American people. They purposely cause great division and distrust. They can also cause war. They are very dangerous and sick. Ambassador, what wars have we started?
Look, I think the issue of press bias has been around for a long, long time. As a boy, I supported Barry Goldwater in 1964. I thought the press was biased against him. I don't think it's changed much since then.
Absolutely agreed. There is press bias. People, people get stories wrong, and people are called out for it, and we should be called out if we make a mistake. Cause war, sick, divisive. This is taking it to a completely different level.
Well, that's the president's view based on the attacks that the media have made on him. There have been other administrations that have been highly critical of the press as well. You can go back. I remember John Kennedy cutting off the White House subscription to the New York Times.
It was the Herald Tribune, but close enough.
Sorry, close enough. I was much younger then. What can I say? But I think this is this kind of adversary relationship is typical.
Okay, North Korea. This week we.
So, like I said, I thought that was a very light questioning by Chris Wallace. His main focus was, how does the media help start wars without talking about the Iraq War and Vietnam and remember the Maine? And I've sort of beat that issue to death. But I have one more Fox News Sunday clip, and I was starting to think, Chris Wallace is actually going to ask Marco Rubio about obstruction of justice based on this tweet telling where Trump tells Jeff Sessions, you should stop investigating the witch hunt. You should stop Robert Mueller from investigating this witch hunt. And later, Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, well, when he says should, it's, he's not saying must. Or Rudy Giuliani also said this, that, it's just his opinion, even though it's sort of like obstruction of justice in plain sight. But that never comes up in this question with Chris Wallace. He starts with that, and I'm thinking, it's about obstruction of justice, but for some reason he combines it with the question about should Donald Trump sit down and answer interview questions with Robert Mueller, and that's all that they talk about, even though they miss obstruction of justice in plain sight. And that's the Fox News way, and even Chris Wallace, the supposedly straight news anchor on Fox News Sunday, no obstruction of justice. And I will talk about that a little more with you after you watch this second to last news clip together over here.
Trump this week tweeted this about the Russia investigation. I want to put it up on the screen. Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now before it continues to stain our country any further. Afterwards, you said that Special Counsel Robert Mueller should be allowed to finish his work and all the truth should come out. In pursuit of that truth, should President Trump sit down with a special counsel to answer any questions about Russian collusion, about obstruction of justice? And what if he refuses and the special counsel gets a subpoena?
Well, the second question is really for the president's lawyers. I'm not in a position to give legal advice to the president about what the right thing to do or not do in those circumstances. But let me talk about the first part of it, and that is the president, look, this is no mystery, okay? He believes strongly, he says he knows for a fact, obviously, that he did not collude with the Russians, and he thinks this investigation that Mueller's conducting is solely about collusion, and that's how he feels very strongly about that. My position, based on everything I know about this case, is the following. I believe it is in the best interest of the president and of the United States of America and the American people for that investigation to run the course, for all the truth to come out, and I think that's the best thing that could happen for him, and I think that's the best thing that could happen for the country. Obviously, he is annoyed by that investigation continuing to go on because it's about him, and he believes and has said repeatedly and emphatically that he did not collude with the Russians. I'm limited in what I can say because the Senate is still doing our investigation, but I'm comfortable in saying this. If there was evidence, strong evidence of collusion, I guarantee you it would have been leaked by now. But let's wait for the process to play itself out. And I think that's what should happen. Mueller should continue. He should finish his work, and the truth should come out. And I think that's in the best interest of everyone, including the president.
But as part of that process, and you say the best interest of the president and the country, should he sit down and answer all questions?
Well, it's easy to say that from a political realm, but that's not an interview. It's an interview with a law enforcement official, with a special prosecutor. And there are plenty of people who are innocent whose lawyers would tell them do not sit down and answer questions from a prosecutor because there's all sorts of other problems involved with that. That's a decision for the president to make alongside with his attorneys. It's my understanding from what I've read in the press that he wants to do it. It's his attorneys who have questions about that. But there are plenty of innocent people whose lawyers tell them do not sit down with a prosecutor and answer questions. So I don't want to prejudge this or somehow imply that by not sitting down, he's guilty of something.
Let's turn to North Korea. Do you?
I don't know. I used to be a criminal defense attorney, and I can understand the argument that you don't want to sit down with the prosecutor, but that's not when your client is president of the United States. I mean, the President of the United States shouldn't really be taking the Fifth Amendment to avoid incriminating himself by testifying on such a matter of public importance. It's not a good look for the leader of the country and the leader of the executive branch. I think that's sort of a different standard than just your regular criminal defendant, but I also was really disappointed, as I said before I showed that clip, that Chris Wallace didn't ask about obstruction of justice. It didn't even come up, even though the tweet he was talking about where he tells his own attorney general to stop the investigation, that's basically like obstruction of justice in plain sight. And I also don't understand why they both seem to believe that there's no evidence of collusion, which is a view that apparently Margaret Brennan, the host of CBS's Face the Nation, also shares, and she tried to get Representative Adam Schiff in this final news clip before I do the bonus Sandy and Dash clip, although Sandy's kind of whining over there. But this is Margaret Brennan trying to get Adam Schiff to agree there's no evidence of collusion so far, and despite all the things we know about the George Papadopoulos meeting and possibly Roger Stone talking to Guccifer 2.0 and of course the Trump Tower meeting on June 9th, 2016, and I'm even like missing that they originally said there was like no contacts with the Russians, and in one of those clips didn't they say like over 80 contacts with the Russians, and then they said the contacts weren't about the election, and then well, it's gone so far to now it's to like collusion isn't a crime, but here Margaret Brennan is trying to get Adam Schiff to say there isn't evidence of collusion, and there obviously is, maybe not to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. That we'll have to wait and see. But Adam Schiff, I think, does a fairly good job of refuting that in the final news clip for tonight here.
I want to draw a distinction, since we've been saying here that some of the facts can get muddled here in the president's language. I want to make sure we're being precise in our conversation. Can you agree that there has been no evidence of collusion, coordination, or conspiracy that has been presented thus far between the Trump campaign and Russia?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight. Now, that's a different statement than saying that there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt of a criminal conspiracy. Bob Mueller will have to determine that. But of course, the entire meeting
you
at Trump
acknowledge
Tower,
that the FBI has not presented it thus far. I'm drawing this distinction because this is what the White House is arguing here, that the president is drawing a distinction, that he is saying when he says hoax and witch hunt that he means one thing and that it's not really trying to disassociate himself from what his national security team says.
Well, first of all, we haven't seen what Bob Mueller has produced in terms of the evidence yet. So in terms of FBI proof, they're not going to present proof to the Congress. We're doing our own investigation, and we've revealed evidence, I think, that certainly goes to the issue of conspiracy and collusion, a lot of which is now public. But I do think that the president continues to cast doubt on whether he accepts the fundamental conclusion that Russia intervened, whether there was a conspiracy or not. He continues to raise questions about it. Indeed, his attempt to retract his statement in Helsinki that he doesn't see why the Russians would intervene, that goes well beyond any allegations of conspiracy. So it's the president himself who's created this very muddled message. And the issue, I think, for us in the midterms is, what message is Putin hearing? Is he hearing the message that we heard from Coates and Wray and others in that press conference in the White House, or is he hearing the message of the President of the United States? And I fear that the message that the Kremlin cares most about is what they hear from Donald Trump, and that is still one of denial and cover for the Russians.
Is the DNC better prepared for?
So I definitely agree with Adam Schiff there. I think I pretty much gave my critique of that clip, and especially Margaret Brennan's questioning there before I showed the clip. So I hope you appreciate all the clips I picked out. That was the last news clip. I appreciate all of you who have been watching the show, who've been commenting along the way. I've been reading your comments along the way, and especially the Super Chat contributors. This is like the last list I saw. Something about a handful of biscuits for Sandy. I've been thinking of trying to set up some sort of like Sandy cam over there, and maybe I could even, like, for certain contributions, give treats to Sandy on, you know, and do it live on camera. That might be an upgrade coming up later in the year. But I appreciate all of you who helped out that way. If you also want to support the show through PayPal or Patreon, there are links down in the video description for that. Before I finished the show, I did promise a Dash and Sandy clip. Sandy, of course, I always get a clip of her lying down right there, and she's still lying down right there, though in a slightly different position. Dash, I had to like go seek out and get a clip of him before the show started, and I've edited them together for the Dash and Sandy clip for the cat and dog video fans out there over here. Lie down. So Dash, Sandy, and of course Lawrence Tribe's American Constitutional Law book. Sandy's still lying down there. Maybe next week I'll have a clip of Dash and Sandy together. It's like I almost had them together. They were together briefly. It's like the unicorn clip, but at least I can edit them together. I appreciate those of you who joined me, and also the recorded show viewers. Just give me a thumbs up, give me a supportive comment. If you want to support me financially, there's more down in the video description. And until next week, or until I have some reason to make some other edited, produced video, or maybe a Fox News bias video somewhere in the future. I actually have this idea for a video where I compare something Noam Chomsky said this last week with something Rand Paul said a couple weeks ago in a clip I showed in my Sunday Clip Roundup, that sounds eerily similar, like taking Russia's side in the Russia versus NATO conflict. And Noam Chomsky and Rand Paul said almost the same thing. Maybe I'm. Let me know if you're still watching. If you think I should make that video, like Rand Paul, Noam Chomsky have same Russia talking points, something like that, because it's like eerily similar. Let me know what you think down in the comment section until I make some video like that or other video, or until next Sunday when I'll be back with my clips I pick out from the big 5 corporate outlets. I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.